I used a classic cheat and got caught, though at first I thought it would be impossible for anyone to notice. It started the way such things always do, with a small temptation, a voice in the back of my mind whispering that no one would ever know. I had convinced myself that it was clever, not dishonest. A trick, not a crime. And so I leaned into it, slowly, carefully, until I was caught in my own trap. It was during an exam, the kind of test that could decide a person's future. Weeks of study had worn me thin, and I hadn't prepared enough. Each page of the textbook had felt heavier than the last, and every time I tried to focus, my mind wandered. Friends of mine had whispered about the old tricks, tiny notes folded in sleeves, formulas carved into erasers, answers written faintly on the palm of a hand. The classic cheats, everyone called them, relics from generations of desperate students. Most people laughed about them as if they were urban legends, stories passed around but rarely tried. I told myself it was harmless. The night before the exam, I sat at my desk with a blank sheet of paper. My hands trembled a little as I wrote out equations in the smallest handwriting I could manage, filling every corner of the page. When it was done, I carefully folded it until it was smaller than my thumb and slid it into my sleeve. A simple plan, I thought. No one would ever look there. The next morning, the exam hall was cold, silent except for the shuffle of papers and the scratch of pens. I felt the folded slip against my skin, a strange comfort, like armor. At first, I tried to answer without it. But when the questions grew harder, panic began to gnaw at me. My eyes darted to the teacher, pacing slowly between the rows. My heart hammered. Then, when his back was turned, I slid the slip from my sleeve, just enough to read a formula. Relief washed over me. One answer led to another. For a few minutes, I felt untouchable. But cheats have a way of revealing themselves, as if the very act of using them calls down a curse. The second time I glanced at the slip, I looked up to find the teacher's eyes fixed on me. Not angry at first, not even surprised, just cold, steady knowing. He walked toward me without a word. I froze, the paper half hidden in my hand. My mind screamed for me to drop it, to swallow it, to do anything at all. But I couldn't move. He reached out, plucked the folded note from my fingers, and unfolded it slowly, as though he already knew exactly what he would find. Around me, I felt the air shift as other students looked up. Some pretended not to notice. Others stared outright. My face burned hot. "You're done," he said quietly, and that was worse than if he had shouted. I was escorted out of the room while the others bent over their papers, their pens scratching on in the silence I left behind. Each step down the hallway felt like a sentence. My chest was heavy, my throat tight. I thought about my parents, about the disappointment that would etch itself into their voices. I thought about the reputation I had worked to build, undone in an instant. The punishment came swiftly. The exam was void. My record would carry the mark of dishonesty. No pleading could erase it. Friends avoided the subject, some offering awkward comfort, others keeping their distance, as if my mistake might rub off on them. I had used a classic cheat, the kind told in whispered stories and passed down as though it were clever. But cleverness is not the same as wisdom. Looking back now, I see how foolish I was. I had thought I was outsmarting a system, but I was only betraying myself. The memory of being caught, the eyes of my teacher, the silence of my classmates, the weight of that tiny folded paper, stays with me even now. A single moment, a small cheat, and yet it stretched into something far larger, something I cannot forget. That was the day I learned the truth behind every shortcut. The cost is always higher than the gain, and the catch comes sooner than you think. I used a classic cheat and got caught, and the memory of it still clings to me like a shadow I can't shake off. When people talk about cheating, they often tell it like a joke, a daring little stunt pulled off by someone clever enough to get away with it. They make it sound almost glamorous. But no one ever talks about what happens when the trick fails, when the mask slips and you're left exposed in front of everyone. It had all begun weeks before the exam. I had promised myself I'd study, promised that this time would be different. But promises are fragile things, and each day I found reasons to delay. There was always tomorrow, Always another hour I could spend scrolling on my phone or lying on my bed staring at the ceiling. The exam loomed closer like a storm on the horizon, but instead of preparing for it, I hid from it. By the time the night before arrived, the storm was already overhead, and I had nothing. That was when the idea crept in. I remembered the whispers from older students, stories of classic cheats that had worked for decades. Some scribbled notes on water bottle labels, others etched formulas into the sides of rulers. A few even wrote directly on their arms beneath their sleeves. It was reckless, yes, but it was also tested, tried, and trusted. They called it classic because it had survived generations of desperate souls. I told myself I wasn't doing anything new. I was just borrowing from history. So I took a sheet of paper and began writing. Each number, each formula, each tiny word was carefully crammed into the smallest space I could manage. It was like building a lifeboat out of scraps, something that could save me when the ocean of the exam tried to drown me. When I was done, I folded it tightly until it was almost invisible. I slid it into my sleeve, pressing it against my wrist, and felt the paper's presence like a secret heartbeat. The next morning, the exam hall swallowed me whole. Rows of desks stretched out endlessly, each one filled with students hunched over, their faces tense, their pens already moving. The silence was suffocating. The invigilator walked slowly up and down the aisles, his shoes clicking against the floor with a rhythm that reminded me of a clock ticking down. At first, I tried to resist. I told myself maybe I didn't need the slip after all. But the question stared back at me, cruel and unfamiliar. Each line of text blurred as my panic grew. My palms were sweating, my throat dry. I felt the folded paper pressed against my skin, a promise waiting to be used. And then, almost without thinking, I slid it out. For a moment, it was magic. The formulas I couldn't recall appeared before me like answers whispered by a ghost. My pen moved quickly, my panic easing. I thought, this works. This is going to save me. But the world has a way of noticing lies. The second time I glanced at the slip, my hand trembling just slightly, I looked up, and there he was, the invigilator. His eyes met mine, sharp and unblinking. He didn't need to say a word. I knew he had seen everything. My stomach dropped. He walked toward me, calm and deliberate, each step heavier than the last. I wanted to hide the slip, to crumple it, to make it vanish. But my body betrayed me. My fingers froze, my chest locked tight. He reached down and plucked the paper from my hand as though he had been waiting for this very moment. Slowly, almost ceremoniously, he unfolded it and read the cramped writing inside. The silence that followed was unbearable. The scratching of pens around me continued, but it felt distant, muffled, as though I were already cut off from the rest of the world. My classmates' eyes flicked toward me, some curious, some pitying, others silently gloating. I felt heat flood my face. "You're done," he said, his voice low but final. I was escorted out of the hall, the sound of chairs creaking and pens moving chasing me down the corridor. The empty hallway felt endless, my footsteps echoing like accusations. Outside, the sunlight was too bright, too harsh, as though the world itself had turned its face away from me. The punishment was swift and merciless. The exam voided. My record stained with dishonesty. A meeting with my parents that ended in silence heavier than any lecture. My father's disappointment, my mother's quiet tears, those cut deeper than the teacher's words ever could. And yet the worst punishment was not official. It was the memory, the look in the invigilator's eyes, the way my classmates avoided me afterward, their silence more condemning than gossip. The way I avoided mirrors, because in them I saw not cleverness, not rebellion, but weakness. The slip of paper had been small, but the shadow it cast stretched far. I had thought I was outsmarting the system, but in truth, I had only betrayed myself. The classic cheat wasn't clever, wasn't bold. It was a trap, and I walked straight into it. And to this day, I remember the sound of the paper being unfolded, the silence in that exam hall, and the words that marked the end of it all. "You're done." I used a classic cheat and got caught, and although that single day has passed, its consequences kept echoing into everything that came after. At first, I thought it would be a temporary humiliation, something sharp but short-lived, like tearing off a bandage. I told myself people would forget, that time would smooth it over. But time, I learned, does not erase dishonor. It only deepens the grooves it cuts into your life. The days after the exam were unbearable. School was no longer the place I knew. The same corridors where I once laughed with friends now felt like narrow tunnels that everyone was watching me walk through. The whispers weren't always loud enough to hear clearly, but I didn't need the words. I felt the weight of them. Every glance, every smirk, every sudden silence when I entered a room told me I had become a story, the one who got caught. Friends I thought were close kept their distance. Not openly, not cruelly, but carefully, as though I were a stain they didn't want touching them. Some smiled awkwardly, some avoided eye contact, and a few pretended I wasn't there at all. It wasn't anger I saw in their eyes, but fear. Fear of association. They didn't want teachers or classmates to think they were like me. At home, it was worse. My father didn't yell. He didn't need to. His silence was a punishment sharper than any words. My mother tried to speak to me, her voice soft and trembling, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes, and it broke something inside me. For days, meals were eaten in silence. The house felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves pressed closer in judgment. But the deepest wound was inside me. Before, I had thought of myself as clever, someone who could find a way through anything. Afterward, every time I looked in the mirror, I saw only a coward, someone who couldn't face difficulty without trying to slip past it. The memory replayed again and again, the invigilator's steps, the slip of paper unfolding, the words "you're done." I tried to study harder after that, tried to prove I could succeed without shortcuts. But it wasn't just about exams anymore. It was about reclaiming my own belief in myself, something that had shattered when I was caught. Each time I opened a book, I fought the voice that whispered I would fail anyway, that I had already marked myself as weak. The label followed me longer than I expected. Teachers looked at me differently, even those who tried not to show it. Trust is a fragile thing, and once it's broken, it doesn't rebuild easily. I could see it in the way they hesitated before answering my questions, in the way they double-checked my work, in the way their praise always seemed guarded, cautious, as though they were waiting for me to slip again. Over time, I realized the worst part wasn't that I had been caught. The worst part was that I had allowed myself to believe that a trick could replace effort, that deceit could be a substitute for courage. That was the true failure. Years later, I still think about it. Not every day, but often enough. Whenever I am tempted to take an easy way out, I remember the folded paper, the silence of that exam hall, and the look in my teacher's eyes. I remember how quickly respect can turn into suspicion, how one moment of weakness can ripple out into years of regret. I used a classic cheat once, and I got caught. And though the world moved on, a part of me never has. The cheat ended in a single word, but the lesson, it has lasted a lifetime.